in York. I couldn't pass myself off as an Earther anymore. But I'd like to go back and see what the old life was like, now that I know what it's like to be on the other side for a while. It'll hurt when you find out, Rolf. I'll take that chance, but I want to go. Maybe my grandmother will be there. The surgeons made her young and pretty again every few years. She looked like my sister when I left. Laney nodded her head. There's no point arguing with him, Kennedy. He has to go back there and find out, so let him alone. Rolf smiled. Thanks for understanding. He took out Quentin's card and turned it over and over in his hand. Rolf went to York on foot, dressed in his best clothes, with his face as clean as it had been in some years. Spacertown was just across the river from York, and the bridges spanning the river were bright and gleaming in the mid-afternoon sun. The bombs had landed on York during the long-forgotten war, but somehow they had spared the sprawling borough across the river, and so York had been completely rebuilt, once the radioactivity had been purged from the land, while what was now Spacertown consisted mostly of buildings that dated back to the 20th century. York had been the world's greatest seaport. Now it was the world's greatest spaceport. The sky was thick with incoming and outgoing liners. The passengers on the ship usually stayed at York, which had become an even greater metropolis than it had been before the bomb. The crew crossed the river to Spacertown, where they could find their own kind. York and Spacertown were like two separate planets. There were 3 bridges spanning the river, but most of the time they went unused, except by spacemen going back home or by spacemen going to the spaceport for embarkation. There was no regular transportation between the two cities. To get from Spacertown to York, you could borrow a jet car, or you could walk. Rolf walked. He enjoyed the trip. I'm going back home, he thought, as he paced along the gleaming arc of the bridge, dressed in his Sunday best. He remembered the days of his childhood, his parentless childhood. His earliest memory was of a fight at the age of 6 or so. He had stood off what seemed like half the neighborhood, ending the battle by picking up an older bully, much feared by everyone, and heaving him over a fence. When he told his grandmother about the way he had won the fight, she cried for an hour, and never told him why. But they had never picked on him again, though he knew the other boys had jeered at him behind his back as he grew bigger and bigger over the years. Ape, they called him. Ape. But never to his face. He approached the York end of the bridge. A guard was waiting there, an Earther guard, small and frail, but with a sturdy-looking blaster at his hip. Going back, Spacer? Rolf started. How did the guard know? And then he realized that all the guard meant was, are you going back to your ship? No, I'm going to a party at Cal Quentin's house. Tell me another, Spacer. The guard's voice was light and derisive. A swift poke in the ribs would break him in half, Rolf thought. I'm serious. Quentin invited me. Here's his card. If this is a joke, it'll mean trouble. But go ahead, I'll take your word for it. Rolf marched on past the guard almost nonchalantly. He looked at the address on the card. 12406 Kenman Road. He rooted around in his fading memory of York, but he found the details had blurred under the impact of 5 years of Mars and Venus and the Belt and Neptune. He did not know where Kenman Road was. The glowing street signs were not much help either. One said 278th Street, and the other said 72nd Avenue. Kenman Road might be anywhere. He walked on a block or two. The streets were antiseptically clean, and he had the feeling that his boots, which had lately trod in Spacertown, were leaving dirt marks along the street. He did not look back to see. He looked at his wristchron. It was getting late, and Kenman Road might be anywhere. He turned into a busy thoroughfare, conscious that he was attracting attention. The streets here were crowded with little people who barely reached his chest. They were all about the same height, and most of them looked alike. A few had had radical surgical alterations, and every one of these was different. One had a unicorn-like horn, another an extra eye which cunningly resembled his real ones. The Earthers were looking at him furtively, as they would at a tiger or an elephant strolling down a main street. "Where are you going, Spacer?" said a voice from the middle of the street. Rolf's first impulse was to snarl out a curse and keep moving, but he realized that the question was a good one, and one whose answer he was trying to find out for himself. He turned. Another policeman stood on the edge of the walkway. "Are you lost?" The policeman was short and delicate looking. Rolf produced his card. The policeman studied it. "What business do you have with Quentin?" Just tell me how to get there, Rolf said. I'm in a hurry. The policeman backed up a step. All right, take it easy. He pointed to a kiosk. Take the sub car here. There's a stop at Kenman Road. You can find your way from there. I'd rather walk it, Rolf said. He did not want to have to stand the strain of riding in a subcar with a bunch of curious, staring Earthers. Fine with me, the policeman said. It's about 200 blocks to the north. Got a good pair of legs? Never mind, Rolf said. I'll take the subcar. Kenman Road was a quiet little street in an expensive-looking end of York. 12406 was a towering building which completely overshadowed everything else on the street. As Rolf entered the door, a perfumed little Earther with a flashing diamond where his left eye should have been and a skin stained bright purple appeared from nowhere. "We've been waiting for you. Come on. Cal will be delighted that you're here." The elevator zoomed up so quickly that Rolf thought for a moment that he was back in space. But it stopped suddenly at the 62nd floor, and as the door swung open, the sounds of wild revelry drifted down the hall. Rolf had a brief moment of doubt when he pictured Laney and Kanaday at this very moment, playing cards in their moldering hovel while he walked down this plastiline corridor back into a world he had left behind. Quentin came out into the hall to greet him. Rolf recognized him by the missing ears. His skin was now a subdued blue to go with his orange robe. "I'm so glad you came," the little Earther bubbled. "Come on in and I'll introduce you to everyone." The door opened photoelectrically as they approached. Quentin seized him by the hand and dragged him in. There was the sound of laughter and of shouting. As he entered, it all stopped, suddenly, as if it had been shut off. Rolf stared at them quizzically from under his lowering brows, and they looked at him with ill-concealed curiosity. They seemed divided into two groups. Clustered at one end of the long hall was a group of Earthers who seemed completely identical, all with the same features, looking like so many dolls in a row. These were the Earthers he remembered, the ones whom the plastic surgeons had hacked at and hewn until they all conformed to the prevailing concept of beauty. Then at the other end was a different group. They were all different. Some had glittering jewels set in their foreheads, others had no lips, no hair, extra eyes, 3 nostrils. They were a weird and frightening group, highest product of the plastic surgeon's art. Both groups were staring silently at Rolf. "Friends, this is Rolf. Rolf Dekker," Rolf said after a pause. He had almost forgotten his own last name. "Rolf Dekker, just back from outer space. I've invited him to join us tonight. I think you'll enjoy meeting him." The stony silence slowly dissolved into murmurs of polite conversation as the partygoers adjusted to the presence of the newcomer. They seemed to be discussing the matter earnestly among themselves, as if Quentin had done something unheard of by bringing a spacer into an Earther party. A tall girl with blonde hair drifted up to him. "Ah, Joni," Quentin said. He turned to Rolf. "This is Joni. She asked to be your companion at the party. She's very interested in space and things connected with it." Things connected with it, Rolf thought, meaning me. He looked at her. She was as tall an Earther as he had yet seen, and probably suffered for it when there were no spacers around. Furthermore, he suspected her height was accentuated for the evening by special shoes. She was not of the Individ persuasion, because her face was well shaped, with smooth, even features, with no individualist distortion. Her skin was unstained. She wore a clinging off-the-breast tunic. Quite a dish, Rolf decided. He began to see that he might enjoy this party. The other guests began to approach timidly, now that the initial shock of his presence had worn off. They asked silly little questions about space, questions which showed that they had only a superficial interest in him and were treating him as a sort of talking dog. He answered as many as he could, looking down at their little painted faces with concealed contempt. They think as little of me as I do of them, the thought hit him suddenly, and his broad face creased in a smile at the irony. Then the music started. The knot of Earthers slowly broke up and drifted away to dance. He looked at Joni, who had stood patiently at his side through all this. "I don't dance," he said. "I never learned how." He watched the other couples moving gracefully around the floor, looking for all the world like an assemblage of puppets. He stared in the dim light, watching the couples clinging to each other as they rocked through the motions of the dance. He stood against the wall, wearing his ugliness like a shield. He saw the great gulf which separated him from the Earthers spreading before him, as he watched the dancers and the gay chatter and the empty badinage.